Welcome to the Tintin podcast, where we explore the adventures of Tintin, one story at a time. Whether you're a long-time fan of the books or you're only just discovering the world of the boy reporter, this is the place for you. We'll be taking a deep dive into Hergé's iconic series, unpacking the stories, art, historical context, and everything else that makes Tintin a global phenomenon. Each episode will explore one of Tintin's adventures in detail, with plenty of trivia scattered right through. I'm Varun, and today we're starting off with the very first Tintin story ever written, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. Joining me today are Wes, who grew up in the southwest United States and actually learned to read with Tintin as a kid.
Hey everyone.
Greg from the northeast US, whose love for adventure and travel was sparked by Tintin.
Hi everyone, how you doing?
And Louisa, whose globetrotting hippie parents introduced her to Tintin, which she used to teach herself to read. And now 30 years later, she's enjoying the adventures all over again with her daughter.
Hello everybody.
I suppose we have to go back to where it all began, and that would take us back to 1929 in Belgium, where Tintin in the Land of the Soviets saw its first light of day in a Belgian children's newspaper called Le Petit Vingt-et-un. So Greg, given that Hergé started Tintin on his editor's suggestion, how do you think he went about marrying the art and science of this project?
I think he took advantage of a situation, really. Clearly the head of the newspaper had very clear politics and very clear goal and what he wanted that comic to achieve. And Harris probably just took advantage of the situation because it didn't seem long until he branched off on his own.
Not a bad brief to get at 22, Louisa.
Yeah, I think being 22 is like a defining point in anybody's life, but it's kind of when you learn what adults you want to be. And for Hirsch, it was like how he navigated politics, his career, his passion. I think that the pair of them existed inside him in some form. And even at 22, they were just like a rudimentary form of his passion and his politics in some way, you know?
Well, we now know that this was the interwar period in Europe, and speaking of politics, Wes, how close does this book get to the other P word, propaganda, against the Soviet Union, communism, socialism, you name it?
Yeah, so I don't know a ton about that time period in Russia, but much of the story seemed to me reading it, and from a little bit of research that I've done, as sort of pretty heavy-handed propaganda based on the group, the newspaper that he was writing in, and sort of communism being threatening to that group. So I'm sure there's definitely some kernels of truth to it, but it also felt pretty scaremongery. And Hergé later said in his process that he basically based this entire book on a single book. It was called Moscow Unveiled, 9 years work in the land of the Soviets. And that was written by a Belgian consul, Joseph Dulay. I apologize for my pronunciation for this and later on. But this book that it was based on was later described as complete caricature, and the author stated his desire to prove that communism was completely bad and perverse. So I guess to put it lightly, he definitely had a point of view, this author, that he was getting across, and that also came across in Hergé's work as well.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the portrayal in Soviets is pretty heavy-handed, and that's my belief is that's entirely as it was intended. This was not intended to be blunt in any way or subtle. But it draws off of some pretty terrible experiences during that time. So collectivization was real. Famine was real. An estimated 40 to 50 million people starved during this time period. They didn't die, but they starved. And malnutrition, I've worked for the World Food Program, and malnutrition has a terrible impact on your brains and your bodies, especially when you're young. So, this is real stuff. So while it's extremely crude, this was happening in the world at the time. And I think, again, we just need to understand people's sophistication when it came to media at the time, compared to ours now, where we are just flooded with information compared to at that time period. That was the paper. You just kind of took it at face value. So yeah, it was a bit of both.
So he was under pressure, Hergé.
Oh, yeah. I mean, imagine that you're a political satirist, but you're tasked with educating children against the global threat of communism at that time, you know? So accuracy would be hard even for like a seasoned cartoonist, let alone a novice like in his first attempt. So it's easy to see how even genuine threats in communism have less credibility when they're woven into like a fun comic narrative. But that's not really his fault, you know, that he had these political tones or that they came off that way. It's really just the time that he's living in and his young age, perhaps.
As for the story itself, it's quite random and disjointed to say the least, and surely I'm not the only one thinking that.
Yeah, it felt to me most like a bunch of gags sort of stitched together, which I kind of enjoyed, but it definitely felt like the beginning serialization of a TV show or comics sort of early on. And then usually as those continue and progress, if they get the opportunity to, there's often a larger story that starts being told. And so this started out in those in that serialized format, and it felt like pretty disjoint in this one. Um, but I really liked some of the bits in this, like the bits of the airplane propeller when he crashes and has to make a new propeller, and then he starts going backwards, and then he has to make a new one, and he's fast at it. Oh, it was great. I loved that. I thought it was pretty funny.
Louisa, did you know what was going on in the story?
No, I think that he is better able to use those tropes in later books, but in this, they're definitely just thrown in to speed up the plot. Like they're just hodgepodge together. It's like he's trying to have a formula for kids to just keep up with it and be interested. But I think he struggles through this in Congo and in America, and then after that, he kind of finds a way to do it a little bit better.
And Greg, you have a theory as to why this book is the way it is.
Yeah, so as the series was serialized and released over a full year, each week had to have its own story arc. Otherwise, people aren't going to necessarily pay too much attention. So it necessarily had to be this series of just clipped events that took place, unless they did some serious work and tried to, blend it all together a little better. But otherwise, it really had to be that. So yeah, it was. I found it highly disjointed, obviously, and just try this in Congo. Even just trying to summarize the story a little bit is next to impossible because it just flows kind of into one gag adventure to the next. So yeah, it was. It was definitely a tough read. I had to, the old books I used to just go straight through them, but this one I couldn't do that. It took me three readings. So
Wes, you have a bunch of items jotted down from this book, The Soviets, that will reappear in later Tintin adventures. Can you take us down that path of reverse deja vu without too many spoilers?
Yeah, so reading through this, I was struck with the things that I recognized from later adventures. I think Hergé sometimes refined them more in later adventures, but also sometimes he didn't. Sometimes they were the same bits over and over verbatim because worked well. They were great. So in this first adventure, I noticed Tintin already does that little classic happy dance thing that he does where he jumps in the air and he sort of taps his heels together and um, when he's happy about something. I thought that was pretty funny seeing him do that so early on. And he does something where he mimes sort of playing a recorder or a flute in one of the panels. Um, don't know what that's about, but he does that later on as well. Snowy in this one is already thinking about food 24/7. He's obsessed with food already. Tintin is kidnapped using chloroform in this, as well as kidnapped by cab drivers, which shows up in the calculus affair, Tintin in America. So that's already happening. And Snowy, he's dressed in a costume in this one when he gets dressed up as a lion. And when I was reading it, I knew it reminded me of something. And I was flipping through the other Tintin books I have, and Snowy, if you look, he looks identical in Destination Moon when he's dressed in an astronaut suit. Not to spoil that, but you do get to see that in Destination Moon, and it looks really similar. The last thing that I'll note is I thought Hergé's description or depiction of how he tries to artistically depict being drunk was kind of interesting. Like in this one, he had a panel with a bunch of floating keyholes when he's trying to unlock a hotel door, and that reoccurs throughout the series in many different ways. I'd say in The Secret of the Unicorn and Explorers on the Moon, Snowy and Captain Haddock start seeing double, and the panels you see double. Later on, there's some surreal scenes with Captain Haddock and Snowy and the angel and demons on his shoulder. So I thought those stood out to me. Are there any other ones that stood out to y'all?
Oh yeah, I noticed a whole lot. So I'd written a few. I won't go through all of them because I got a little obsessed when I was going through because I was like, everything that I'm seeing in this is in a later book, practically everything. And it's kind of cute how he's trying out all of these different tropes that he later uses all the time. So some of the ones that I wrote down here, let's see. So one of them was the train wrecks that are always like this huge snarl. So I think that they're all to like showcase our protagonist's mechanical ingenuity, where he like builds a car from scratch, or is like spontaneous bravery, like jumping into a vehicle as it speeds past him, or his knack for disguises. But most of all, the most important part of Tintin is his sense of justice, of course. And in this we see something that's really telling about his character, and that's when he's at the end of a gun and he chooses death over just merely accepting communism. And that says a lot about who Tintin is supposed to be to these children in a way, like and of course this is just the first of seeing all these terrorist plots that end in explosion on mass transit. And then, of course, Snowy is ever present to kind of voice these animalistic needs that Tintin never, he's like too heroic to talk about, like his thirst or hunger, his irritation, his pain. And Snowy is always being bandaged up like a mummy after he's injured, which you see here too. So I thought it was really cute. And there's always like a savior interchange between Tintin and Snowy. So yeah, I loved the conception of all these little tropes.
And Greg, you know where this character trait came from.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think he had first to, there was obviously a ton of things I saw as well. The dancing, the interesting, almost excessive level of violence for a children's cartoon, but people rarely die in it, even though two trains collide, or something like that. So, that carried through, but they lessened that a little bit. I think obviously, something coming out of the post World War I years and leading up to World War II. It was a strange time period. So, I'm sure, the constant references Tintin's into this is it, Snowy. It happens like 12 times in this book. So, but yeah, but prior to writing for Le Petit Vingtième, he had a character that he was drawing that was a Boy Scout. He later described him as, sort of his younger brother. I think his name was Totor. And here it is. Yeah. So the Adventures of Totor, Scout Leader of, I'm not going to pronounce the name so I don't pronounce it incorrectly. But it's basically the Belgian Boy Scout. As I said, he described him as Tintin as Toto's younger brother. So, very similar, daring, brave, smart, clever, all these things we expect from Tintin, came about from Totor originally into, and I think there was even a second cartoon that he had created before he started working on Tintin. I think we see this a lot in other works of art where anything, or at least something that's a series, that people start picking up characters in the beginning, and then they finally they sort of pick one central theme that they like that works, or style, or whatever it may be. So I mean, if you look at, say, how The Simpsons started, or any other number of shows like that.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up Flanderization, which is named after the character in The Simpsons, of course, where as time went on, he sort of it got more into the diddlies of his character, where something is enhanced. And I think that it's generally not always a bad thing because the artist has to evolve and like smooth out elements that are at first like really primitive. So I think that also his progressivism matures at the same rate as his art. So it's kind of like a package deal.
I'm sure all of us picked up on that one frame where Tintin's hair gets permanently windblown to the look we know today. But we also have to point out that Tintin and Snowy, leave alone the captors, were not really consistently drawn across the pages of this book, were they, Wes?
Yeah, it's exciting to see this first draft. Um, it's a little rough, and I never honestly went back to it that much as a kid. I read it a couple times, but never really returned to it.
Well, we now know that Hergé recognized Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, Tintin in the Congo, and Cigars de Pharaoh as the three books which had outdated artwork. But come the time, he only selected the latter two, Cigars and Congo, for redrawing and left out the Soviets. Now it's said that the panels used to craft the Soviets were lost in the mid 1930s, but with those panels around, a quick yes or no around the table, would we have grown up with Tintin in the Land of the Soviets in a book so close to home?
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. Because, like I said earlier, even Hergé thought he was too crude in these versions. So maybe part or all of it would have been lost intentionally or otherwise. I don't know.
No, I don't think so either.
And yet, Soviets was a commercial success in Belgium at the time and was serialized in neighboring France and Switzerland as well. Not bad for Hergé, all of 22 years old, Greg, but do you think it had something to do with the political winds blowing in Europe at the time?
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, I think that Tones said that time period, the interwar time period, was a really distinct period for all the different cultures that are involved. So you could see that Wale, who was Hergé's boss originally, was so heavy-handed in his approach. But obviously, the public really loved it. I think they were seeing things that they hadn't really been exposed to before, and done so by an adventurous character.
Fast forward to today, and you would almost always recommend the first in line of any book or movie or TV show to start it off with, be it the pilot episode or season one or the first part of a franchise and whatnot. I have a feeling, Wes, that Soviets does not fit that rule in the Land of Tintin.
I think you should get at least a couple in, if not most of the way through the other Tintins before you go to the Soviets. This one, I would say to start, my two favorites as a child were Tintin in the Black Island and Tintin in America. So I would probably recommend people to start with either of those and then come back once you have an appreciation and kind of understand Tintin and then check out this one in the Congo.
Yeah, I think he's better premiered to others with these bumbling explorative early books like set aside. Because like I was saying, like his politics, his understanding of the world has to mature with the books, and I think audiences will kind of pick up and relate to them a little bit more contemporary and a little bit less of a 22-year-old reacting to propaganda with these sketches, which is basically what this is.
Greg, what about you?
Yep, I totally agree. I think that people need to sort of immerse themselves in the Tintin universe and understand the characters a bit, and either become a fan or walk away before you really take a look at Tintin in his, frankly, his cruder manifestation. And I have to say, for me, growing up, I was in my probably 12, 13, 14 when I was reading these. And even at that point, I was semi-aware of some of this the cultural baggage that came with Tintin. But I loved him nonetheless in the adventure and everything that came with it. But I am pretty certain, had I read either of Congo or Soviets first, that would have been it. Not just because the art was cruder and the storytelling was cruder and all that, but everything was just cruder, and that's very clear why, because they had a very clear purpose. Again, subtlety was not the purpose, and fun wasn't necessarily the purpose either. This was a Catholic priest pushing an extremely ultra conservative view, a man who was openly fascistic, openly anti Semitic, as were the newspapers that he ran, let alone the racism that we see in things. But, that wasn't a thing at that point. So, I mean, it's there's an ugly side to things. I won't get too into it now for the discussion with Congo, but compared to what the people in Brussels are reading about what's happening in the Belgian Congo, it could not be farther from the truth. It was one of the most vicious colonial enterprises, of this century anyway, or past century. There's some dark sides to the genesis a lot of this, and I think I needed to understand it, and coming as reading those books as a younger person, and finally reading Soviets and Congo as an adult and as a male and a white male, it's odd. There's a very odd tension within me that pushes against a lot of stuff here, as much as I love it. So I think that's part of the reason I really love Tintin. That it's not just wine and roses all the time.
Well, I was just gonna say, Greg, I agree with you on the broad having Tintin. So maybe maybe I don't have the words to explain this right now, but being able to, through Tintin, see a bunch of histories that they were definitely impacted with a point of view, but also I was exposed to other things that I maybe wasn't reading about in history books. I really like that. So that's probably not for the podcast, but I just wanted to agree with you on that, Greg.
Up next, we're going to take up some questions you've chimed in on Reddit for this episode, starting with question 1. Louisa, did Hergé quickly realize that it's not a good idea to have Tintin be so accident prone?
Yeah, I don't think so. At least it's not like a quick realization, because he continues to throw his precious protagonists into the most ridiculously dramatic conflicts, like almost directly into a meat grinder in Tintin in America. But he does enjoy better handling of these things as the books go on, and it's less of like a ridiculous cliffhanger every other panel.
Greg, why is Soviets the book where we see Tintin doing the most journalism?
I have to say that is a point that I had not considered before, and it makes 100% sense to me that he is not only the sort of cultural baggage stuff we've been talking about, but he's his own boss. He doesn't have a guy over his shoulder telling him, no, you're writing about the Soviets this time, and then you're writing about the Congo. He's his own man. That's who wants to be reminded of those early struggling days, maybe. So yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, I personally, even as a kid, I was always like, I wanted things to have a grounding in reality. Like, come on, he's. I didn't even know. I think for the first few books that he was a reporter at all. Again, except for the fact that they said boy reporter. I thought he was like just an adventure guy or something like that. He just goes around. He's independently wealthy. So, but yeah, I wish they just at least showed a little connection. Like, where's he file? And they send him a paycheck, those kind of things. They just want a little grounding on planet Earth, But anyway.
Can I just ask, is he a boy? Is he a boy at all? Like, how old is Tintin? I just have to ask that.
And why does he not age?
Right. I would love to know how old the boy reporter is.
And here's an interesting one, Wes, and we know that the Cold War was one of the overarching themes of the 20th century. So the question goes like, did the Cold War improve the perception of Tintin in the land of the Soviets over time?
I'm not sure about the perception closer to the Cold War, but the perception seems rather tepid. I would say this book right now is probably just for sort of the completionists that already love Tintin. And I was thinking about how to rate it. And just I thought it was kind of funny, so I am giving it 2 out of 7 crystal balls.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Tintin in the land of the Soviets. It's been so much fun unpacking this first adventure and seeing where it all began. Fair to say that while this isn't Hergé's finest book, it sets the stage for the brilliance that follows. Our next episode will be on the controversial Tintin in the Congo, where we'll be looking at its unique story elements, artistic evolution, and recurring themes that start to take shape a little more clearly. Feel free to chime in your questions on the Reddit thread. In the meantime, thanks so much for tuning in, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe as we continue our journey with the Tintin podcast.